3 days ago, I had an after-class conversation with one of my students, a conversation that still has me feeling somewhat shaken. The student is a young man from somewhere in Africa. He was oddly reticent about divulging the country, but I gathered from some of his comments in class that he grew up in or somewhere near Guinea. I had been able to discern, on account of some of his in-class comments, that he is an ardent believer in some form of Christianity. On Monday, he handed me his final project, an 8-page paper on reggae. Having no pressing obligations to tend to, I began browsing his paper. On the first page, I encountered a claim about the soothing power of music, with the biblical story of Saul and David mustered as an illustrative example. As he was sitting nearby, and as I was in a post-lecture mood, I couldn't help mentioning to him that I find the account of Saul one of the most disturbing stories in the entire Bible. The unraveling of an obviously unbalanced warlord, supposedly promoted to monarchical status, to which he was manifestly ill-suited, by a vicious, jealous God whose motivation appears to have been his eagerness to punish an insufficiently trusting chosen people. "Give us a king so that we can be like the other nations," the Israelites had clamored. In the biblical account, Saul's steady descent into madness was driven by that very God who turned his back on the man whose increasingly desperate tool he was, meeting Saul's urgent pleas for guidance with stony silence. Now, this story, by the way, seems to serve the function of legitimizing the reign of David, the first historically verifiable figure in the Bible and undoubtedly one of the shrewdest, most cynical bastards who ever lived. No doubt many of the details of the story were made to order, although there are probably a few factual crumbs scattered through it. After all, David would have had to seize power from some other warlord. I told my student that I found God's treatment of Saul inexcusable and morally repellent. He argued vociferously that God's rejection of Saul was justified. Why? Because Saul was disobedient, carrying out his divine orders only imperfectly, that is, incompletely. He couldn't find it in himself to fulfill God's scorched earth program to the extent of killing every living thing in the city of the Amalekites. He spared a couple of warlords, taking them prisoner instead. He also spared the Amalekites' cattle. It's possible that his sense of empathy kicked in somewhere, sadly belatedly, along the line, as he witnessed the slaughter. And the creator of 100 billion galaxies went postal on his disobedient Palestinian ass. The whole sorry story is told in 1 Samuel 15. So I asked my student what he would do if God ordered him to kill everyone in a room full of people. He told me that he would obey God's orders. Who would he be to disobey them? God would surely have his reasons, and they would be perfect reasons, perhaps beyond our understanding. Who are we to question God? I asked him if he had ever heard of the Nuremberg defense. Unlike the majority of my American students, he had, yet he was not impressed. That was about obedience to worldly leaders. This is about obedience to God. I told him I had too much respect for him to think that he actually meant what he had just told me. He insisted that he meant every word of it. God's will trumps everything. Soon, my student will walk across a makeshift stage in the biggest venue on the OU campus and will be handed a diploma that indicates he's all grown up. His degree will be a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. A Bachelor of Science degree suggests that its bearer has grappled successfully with some of life's big questions and is able to formulate mature responses to them. Like I said, I still find myself shaken 3 days later. During my teenage years, one of my first nagging doubts about the veracity of the Bible had not to do with the miracle stories, because like all evangelical Christians, I figured that God could do whatever he damn well pleased since it was his universe, but with the paucity of information in its pages about interesting, observable phenomena. The opening chapter of Genesis, for instance, a chapter that creationists get all misty-eyed about, tells us nothing about the moon other than that it's one of two great lights. The greater of those great lights was meant to rule the day, that's the Bible's language, and the lesser to rule the night. There's merely passing mention of the stars, almost as though these tiny twinkling objects were an afterthought. Presumably the planets were subsumed to that category, although they're not even mentioned in the first creation story. The author of that chapter seems to have been oblivious of the fact that the moon falls down on its assigned job precisely half the time. And the rest of the biblical authors seem peculiarly unimpressed with the moon's phases, with its obvious periodicity. There are so many correlated phenomena associated with the moon that I cannot understand why the Bible doesn't mention them. There are obvious biblical references to eclipses, from the Apocalypse, for instance, the sun turning black as sackcloth, the moon turning to blood, but no mention whatsoever of the fact that such eclipses occur only at full and new moons, or that they are anything other than divinely inflicted on an ignorant, terrified population. The fact that full and new moons can only be seen on the horizon at sunset or sunrise, while first and third quarter moons are always directly overhead at sunset or sunrise, receives no notice in the Bible whatsoever. There's no mention of the moon's constant alternating waxing and waning. The children's poem, "The Moon is the North Wind's Cookie," contains more lunar information than the Bible. You'd think that a culture that was always lifting up its eyes unto the hills whence cometh its help would have noticed what was going on in the sky above them, and might have had enough native curiosity to do some rough calculations or at least mention the phenomena, but the few astronomical references in the Bible seem to be exclusively astrological, a borrowing from Babylon. It's hard to take seriously a book that has more to say about astrology, for instance, "Let them be for signs and seasons and days and years," than about the actual structure of the universe. If their science was that backward, one does have to wonder about the quality of their theological and ethical insights. Here's a sort of out of left field topic. What is this aversion we have to hair? The vast majority of us, and I mean the entire human population, are pretty much constantly shaving, trimming, or plucking something. How on earth did that happen? Our closest cousins don't do it, do they? I remember a turn of phrase I used to hear from my relatives from time to time. A person, especially a man, who stopped shaving or trimming or having his hair cut was said to have let himself go. A related expression was "gone to seed." These are agricultural metaphors. That makes me suspicious. It sometimes occurs to me that when I'm in a classroom with my students, I'm the only one in that room who could be described as having let myself go. It's been well over a year since I've had a haircut of any kind, and at least as long since I've taken scissors to any part of the thicket that now engulfs my face. The only things I've bothered with recently are my eyebrows, which do tend to bush out alarmingly if unchecked, the corkscrew-shaped aggravations that sprout in certain canals, and the forested pathway that leads to my mouth when I'm devouring the raw antelope that I ran down on foot and strangled with my bare hands. I don't want to be making a bigger mess than I can clean up. At least two of the foregoing examples are purely practical. Perhaps my eyebrows will be the next thing that I let go. I may have just given you more information than you wanted, but I said it to make a point. Most of our concerns with hair are purely cosmetic. At some point along the way, our forebears decided that certain hair was undesirable and must be gotten rid of. Shaving and coiffing became marks of being civilized, an urban metaphor, and cultivated, an agricultural one. For most of my life, I, like everyone I know, bought into an assumption that no one ever thought to question. Now I find it an intriguing line of inquiry. Here's a datum that may be of interest when concerning the foregoing. In my case, it's undoubtedly true that I stopped doing all that maintenance when I came to terms with certain realities. For instance, that I'm not going to be job hunting during the foreseeable future, that I'm not stumping for promotion or tenure, that I absolutely don't care to spend another minute of my life rubbing elbows with the shiny people who constitute polite society, that I'm not going to set the world on fire with the profundity of my music or my prose, that my long and often sad history of romantic entanglements is finally at an end. The embracing of those realities is more liberating than I can possibly relate. I feel much freer now than I ever have. I am as free as a pasture that is finally, after years of tilling, hoeing, raking, grazing, and burning, allowed to go to seed. I wonder if my increasingly hirsute condition isn't a direct expression of my embrace of those realities. It is almost surely true that if I were to find myself looking for a job or seeking the affections of a woman, I would get a haircut and would spend some time bush hogging the South 40. I wouldn't want to look seedy. I guess it makes sense to ask, did our ancestors first turn the negative aspect of agriculture, the getting rid of unwanted botanical intrusions and zoological infestations, on the earth or on themselves? Did they pluck before they learned to weed, or was it the other way around? I imagine they pulled lice off themselves long before they pulled boll weevils off cotton, but that leaves unaddressed the question of the priority of personal versus agricultural grooming. Since the Industrial Revolution, some of the technologies for cosmetic maintenance of the earth and the corpus have proceeded to gather apace. The close relationship between a lawnmower, a bush hogging tractor attachment, an electric hedge trimmer, and an electric hair clipper is almost impossible to miss, and many other parallels could be drawn, between tweezers and post hole diggers, for instance. If it could be demonstrated that people were doing all this mowing and weeding on themselves during the Paleolithic, then a case for adaptive advantage might well be made. If, however, it is a product of the agricultural revolution, as I suspect, then it simply finds its place on a list of other grotesqueries that we've come to endure, including political and economic structures and religions that most of us never question, but that consume more of our lives than we care to imagine.